Chapter 35. It was the first time that a grave had opened in my road of life, and the gap it made in the smooth ground was wonderful. The figure of my sister in her chair by the kitchen fire haunted me night and day. That the place could possibly be without her was something my mind seemed unable to compass, and whereas she had seldom or never been in my thoughts of late, I now had the strongest ideas that she was coming towards me in the street, or that she would presently knock at the door. In my rooms, too, with which she had never been at all associated, there was at once the blankness of death and a perpetual suggestion of the sound of her voice or the turn of her face or figure, as if she was still alive, and had been often there. Whatever my fortunes might have been, I could scarcely have recalled my sister with much tenderness. But I suppose there is a shock of regret which may exist without much tenderness. Under its influence, and perhaps to make up for want of the softer feeling, I was seized with a violent indignation against the assailant from whom she had suffered so much, and I felt that on sufficient proof I could have revengefully pursued Orlick or anyone else to the last extremity. Having written to Joe to offer consolation and assure him that I would come to the funeral, I passed the intermediate days in a curious state of mind I have glanced at. I went down early in the morning and alighted at the Blue Boar in good time to walk over to the forge. It was fine summer weather again, and as I walked along, the times when I was a little helpless creature and my sister did not spare me vividly returned. But they returned with a gentle turn upon them that softened even the edge of Tickler. For now the very breath of the beans and clover whispered to my heart that the day must come when it would be well for my memory that others walking in the sunshine should be softened as they thought of me. At last I came within the sight of the house and saw that Trabb and Co. had put in a funeral execution and taken possession. Two dismally absurd persons, each ostentatiously exhibiting a crutch done up with a black bandage, as if that instrument could possibly communicate comfort to anybody, were posted at the front door, and in one of them I recognized a postboy, discharged from the Boar for turning a young couple into a saw-pit on their bridal morning in consequence of intoxication rendering it necessary for him to ride his horse clasped around the neck with both arms. All the children of the village and most of the women were admiring these sable warders and the closed windows of the house and the forge, and as I came up, one of the two Waters, the postboy, knocked at the door, implying that I was far too much exhausted by grief to have the strength of mind to knock for myself. Another sable warder, a carpenter who had once eaten 2 geese for a wager, opened the door and showed me into the best parlour. Here Mr. Trabb had taken unto himself the best table, and had got all the leaves up, and was holding a kind of black bazaar, with the aid of a quantity of black pins. At the moment of my arrival he had just finished putting someone's hat into a black, long sheet of clothes, like an African baby. So he held out his hand for mine. But I, misled by the action and confused by the occasion, shook hands with him with every testimony of warm affection. Poor Joe, entangled in a little black cloak tied in a large bow under his chin, was seated apart at the upper end of the room, where, as the chief mourner, he had evidently been stationed by Trabb. When I bent down to him and said, "Dear Joe, how are you?" he said, "Pip, old chap, you knowed her when she were a fine figure of a and clasped my hand and said no more. Biddy, looking very neat and modest in her black dress, went quietly here and there and was very helpful. When I had spoken to Biddy, as I thought it not a time for talking, I went and sat near Joe, and there began to wonder in what part of the house she, my sister, was. The air of the parlour being faint with the smell of sweet cake, I looked around for the table of refreshments. It was scarcely visible until one had got used to the gloom. But there was a cut-up plum cake upon it, and there were cut-up oranges and sandwiches and biscuits, and 2 decanters that I knew very well as ornaments, but had never seen used in all my life, one full of port and one of sherry. Standing at this table, I became conscious of the servile Pumblechook in a black cloak and several yards of hatband, who was alternately stuffing himself and making obsequious movements to catch my attention. The moment he succeeded, he came over to me, breathing sherry and crumbs, and said in a subdued voice, "May I, dear sir?" and did. I then recognised Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, the last named in a decent speechless paroxysm in a corner. We were all going to follow, and were in the course of being tied up separately by Trabb into ridiculous bundles. "Which I mean to say, Pip," Joe whispered to me, as if want of Mr. Trabb being called formal in the parlour 2 by 2, and it was dreadfully like a preparation for some grim kind of dance, "which I mean to say, I would, in preference, have carried her myself to the church, along with 3 or 4 friendly others, what come to it with willing hearts and hands, but it were considered what the neighbours would look down upon, and would be of opinions that it were wanting in respect." "Pocket handkerchiefs all out!" cried Mr. Trabb at this point in a depressed business-like voice. "Pocket handkerchiefs out! We are ready." So we all put our pocket handkerchiefs to our faces if our noses were bleeding, and filed out 2 by 2, Joe and I, Biddy and Pumblechook, Mr. and Mrs. Hubble. The remains of my poor sister had been brought round by the kitchen door, and it being a point of undertaking ceremony that 6 bearers must be stifled and blinded under a horrible black velvet housing with a white border, the whole looked like a blind monster with 12 human legs, shuffling and blundering along under the guidance of 2 keepers, the postboy and his comrade. The neighbourhood, however, highly approved of these arrangements, and we were much admired as we went through the village, and the more youthful and vigorous part of the community making dashes now and then to cut us off and lying in wait at the intercept points of vantage. At such times the more exuberant among them called out in an excited manner on our emergence round some corner of expectancy, "Here they come! Here they are!" And we were all cheered. In this process I was much annoyed by the abject Pumblechook, who, being behind me, persisted all the way as a delicate attention in arranging my streaming hatband and smoothing my cloak. My thoughts were further distracted by the excessive pride of Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, who were surpassedly conceited and vainglorious in being members of so distinguished a procession. And now the range of marshes clear lay before us, with the sails of the ships on the river going up and down. And we went into the churchyard close to the graves of my unknown parents, Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above. And when my sister was laid quietly in the earth, while the larks sang high above it, the light wind strewed it with beautiful shadows, of clouds and trees. On the conduct of the worldly-minded Pumblechook while this was a-doing, I dare say no more than all was addressed to me, and that even when those noble passages from the burial service were read, which remind humanity of how it brought nothing into the world and can take nothing out, and how it fleeth like a shadow and never continueth long in one stay, I heard him cough with a reservation of the case of a young gentleman who had come unexpectedly into a large property. When we got back, he had the hardihood to tell me that he wished my sister could have known I had done her so much honour, and to hint that she would have considered it reasonably purchased at the price of her death. After that he drank all the rest of the sherry, and Mr. Hubble drank the port, and the two talked, which I have since observed to be customary in such cases, as if they were quite of another race from the deceased and were notoriously immortal. Finally he went away with Mr. and Mrs. Hubble to make an evening of it, I felt sure, and to tell the Jolly Bargeman that he was the founder of my fortunes and my earliest benefactor. When they were all gone, and when the Trab and his men, but not his boy, I looked for him, had crammed their mummery into bags and were gone too, the house felt far more wholesome. Soon afterwards, Biddy, Joe, and I had a cold dinner, but we dined in the best parlour, not in the old kitchen, and Joe was so exceedingly particular with what he did with his knife and fork and the salt cellar and what not, that there was great restraint upon us. But after dinner, when I made him take his pipe, and when I loitered with him about the forge, and when we sat down together on the great block of stone outside it, we got on better. I noticed that after the funeral, Joe changed his clothes so far as to make a compromise between his Sunday dress and working dress, in which the dear fellow looked natural and more like the man he was. He was very much pleased by my asking if I might sleep in my own little room, and was pleased too, for that I felt I had done a great thing in making that request. When the shadows of evening were closing in, I took the opportunity of getting into the garden with Biddy for a little talk. "Biddy," said I think you might have written to me about these matters." "Do you, Mr. Pip?" said Biddy. "I should have written, if I'd have thought of that." "Don't you suppose that I meant to be unkind, Biddy, when I say that I consider that you ought to have thought of that?" "Do you, Mr. Pip?" She was so quiet, and had such an orderly, good, and pretty way with her that I didn't like the thought of making her cry again. After looking at her downcast eyes as she walked beside me, I gave up the point. "I suppose it will be difficult for you to remain here now, Biddy dear." "Oh, I can't do so, Mr. Pip," said Biddy in the tone of regret, but still with quiet conviction. "I have been speaking to Mrs. Hubble, and I am going to her tomorrow. We hope we shall be able to come and take care of Mr. Gargery together until he settles down." "How are you going to live, Biddy? If you want money—" "No, I am happy to go where I can live," repeated Biddy, striking in with a momentary flush upon her face. "Tell me, Mr. Pip, I am going to try to get to the place of mistress in the new school, nearly finished here. I can be well recommended by all the neighbours, and I hope be industrious and patient, and teach myself while I teach others. You know, Mr. Pip," pursued Biddy with a smile as she raised her eyes to my face, "the new schools are not like the old ones, but I learnt a good deal from you at that time, and had some time to improve since then." "I think you would always improve, Biddy, under any circumstances." "Ah, except in my bad side of human nature," murmured Biddy. It was not so much a reproach as an irresistible thinking aloud. Well, I thought, I would give up that point too. So I walked a little farther with Biddy, looking silently at her downcast eyes. I have not heard the particulars of my sister's death, Biddy. They are very slight, poor thing, she said with one of her hand states. Though she was in a better state of late, rather than worse, for 4 days, and then she came out of it in the evening just at tea time, and said quite plainly, Joe. As she had never said a word for a long time, I ran and fetched in Mr. Gargery from the forge. She made signs to me that she wanted me to sit close to her, and she wanted Joe to sit next to her as well. And she wanted me to put her arms around his neck. So I put them round his neck, and she laid her head down on his shoulder, quite content and satisfied. And so she presently said, Joe, again, and once, pardon, and once, Pip. And so she never lifted her head up any more. And it was just an hour later when we laid it down in her own bed, because we found that she was gone. Biddy cried. The darkening garden and the lane and the stars that were coming out were all blurred in my own light. Nothing was ever discovered, Biddy. Nothing. Do you know what has become of Orlick? I should think from the colour of his clothes that he is working in the quarries. Of course you have seen him since then. Why are you looking at that dark tree in the lane? I saw him there on the night she died. That was not the last time either, Biddy. No, I've seen him there since we have been walking here. It is of no use, said Biddy, laying her hand upon mine, as if time were running out. You know I would not deceive you. He was not there a minute, and he was gone. I revived my utmost indignation to find that she was still pursued by this fellow, and I felt inveterate against him. I told her so, and told her that I would spend any money to make pains to drive him out of the country. By degrees she led me into a more temperate talk, and told me how Joe loved me, and how Joe never complained of anything. She didn't say even of me. She had no need. I knew what she meant. But ever did his duty in his way of life with a strong hand, a quiet tongue, and a gentle heart. Indeed, it would be hard to say too much for him, said I. And Biddy, we must often speak of these things, for of course I shall be often down here now. I am not going to leave poor Joe alone. Biddy said never a single word. Biddy, don't you hear me? Yes, Mr. Pip. Not to mention me calling me Mr. Pip, which appears to me to be in very bad taste, Biddy. What do you mean? What do I mean? Asked Biddy timidly. Biddy, said I in a virtuously self-asserting manner, I must request to know what you mean by this. By this? Said Biddy. Now, don't echo, I retorted. You used to echo, Biddy. Used? Said Biddy. Oh, Mr. Pip, used? Well, I thought I would give up on that point too, and another silent turn in the garden, after which I fell on the main position. Biddy, said I made a remark concerning my coming down here often to see Joe, and you have received that remark with a marked silence. Have the goodness, Biddy, to tell me why." "Are you quite sure, then, that you will come down to see him often?" asked Biddy, stopping in the narrow garden walk and looking at me under the stars with a clear and honest eye. "Oh, dear me," said I, as I found myself compelled to give up Biddy in despair. "This is a very bad side of human nature. Don't say any more, if you please, Biddy. This shocks me very much." For which cogent reason I kept Biddy at a distance during supper, and when I went up to my own little room, took as stately leave of her as I could, in my murmuring soul deem reconcilable with the churchyard and the event of the day. As often as I was restless in the night, and that was every quarter of an hour, I reflected what an unkindness, what an injury, what an injustice Biddy had done me. Early in the morning I was to go. Early in the morning I was out, and looking in unseen at one of the wooden windows at the forge. There I stood, for minutes, looking at Joe working with a glow of health and a strength upon his face that made it show as if the bright sun of the life in store for him were shining out of it. "Goodbye, my dear Joe." "No, don't wipe it off. For God's sake, give me your blackened hand. I shall be down soon and often." "Never too soon, sir," said Joe, "and never too often, Pip." Biddy was waiting for me at the kitchen door with a mug of new milk and a crust of bread. "Biddy," said I, when I had given her my hand at parting, "I am not angry, but I am hurt." "No, don't be hurt," she pleaded quite pathetically. "Let me only be hurt if I have been ungenerous." Once more the mists were rising as I walked away. If they disclosed to me, as I suspect they did, that I should not come back, and that Biddy was quite right, all I can say is they were quite right there also.